The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome to the IT Unity session using Azure Active Directory to secure your apps. This is part 3 of our series covering advanced Azure Active Directory topics. You can access the previous sessions on the IT Unity website using the URL shown here, itunity.com/go/Azure1, Azure 2, or Azure 3. These links will have recordings to the previous sessions as well as the materials that we've presented. My name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP for Office 365. I've been doing speaking and training and mentoring for quite a long time, and my background is in development and solution architecture. And so I'm happy to be here and get through here. If you've been to the previous 2 sessions, you know we've covered an introduction to Azure Active Directory and some coding to integrate with that. And part 3, I apologize, I made a mistake on this slide. Part 3 is more about advanced Azure Active Directory topics. First, we're going to talk about the new V2 app model for Azure Active Directory applications. This is relatively new. It's still in preview, so we'll cover that and compare and contrast a little bit about what we had done before. We'll talk about multi-factor authentication, show how that works. We'll manage Azure Active Directory through application code. We'll talk about the API that is available for us to manage our directory using code. Talk about dynamic groups, some reporting, and then time for question and answer. Most of today will be demonstration. We'll be in the browser. We'll be in Visual Studio. So going through a lot of these features to get you started on the right path. So Azure Apps version 2, as they are called. So there is a tutorial available out there off of the Outlook.com site, dev.outlook.com, having us getting started on this. And to do this, we register our apps using this new portal called apps.dev.microsoft.com. So I'm going to stop here and switch over to the browser. And so we'll go to apps.dev.microsoft.com. This is a new streamlined application registration portal that was designed for Azure Active Directory apps, right? Just to help us compare and contrast, let me open, I should probably do this in a private window. We're going to open a new window here, and this will have the management portal for Azure. So let me go to Manage. All right, so we'll log in as our administrator account. This is what we saw in the previous 2 sessions. In this account, so you'll see our information is in here. And I don't think I typed that right. So while that loads, let me return to the other session here, and I'll close this, and we'll log into this here with my Microsoft, work or school account. Well, before I go further, let me just point out this portal obviously is designed. So when I go to Azure and work in here, we're dealing with things in this Active Directory, right? And so we know this is a work or school account. You can see by the icon here, it has our work or school account. And so the new streamlined portal is designed to work with both as well. Part of this streamlining is, in addition to this version 2, is a unification of the authentication and the application coding for Microsoft Consumer and Microsoft Work or School, right? So you'll see some of that become more clear as you move along. I get my familiar screen here. I'm going to log in with the same account here. And so you'll see I have an application here already that's logged in that will show up. This is really designed for the version 2 apps. And so you see here my app is missing. That's not good. So I'm going to close that. Let's see, make sure we have it here. App my company owns. is it here, the IT Unity demo app. So it's previously registered here. You can see this is my dashboard on this with my app. Notice here on the configure, you can see the screens we had before. We have a somewhat less interface here because it's not using all it's the new streamlined version here. So let me try this again. apps.dev.microsoft.com. My work or school account. Same account. All right, so here is the actual app that I've coded in here before. My Azure App V2, and I'm going to real quick just double check web config and see. Well, let me just run this. I just want to verify I have the right tenant loading here. I'm not so sure what's happening with the app registration. Clearly, this is in preview. So if I click the login, and you can see my accounts from before. They're all still there. Let's try Outlook real quick. Okay, so it's issuing my token, so that's a good sign. All right, so I'm going to go back to this portal here. I don't see where it's at, but I can just show you the screen by clicking Add and Add. We're going to create a new application registration. This would be, again, just the title of an app that I want to have. This is similar to what we saw before with app registration, in which we would give it a name, and it ends up with a client ID, a client secret, and some other information. Right? We're still going to have the similar information. Again, I don't have all of the Azure Chrome to have to weed through, and you can see here it kind of simplifies the screen. So I have my title that issued an application ID for me. I have no application secrets, right? So the app ID and the app secret, or the client secret, and so I can create a password for my application to log in. I can do a key pair if you want public-private keys for more advanced scenarios. So clicking this, as we saw before in the Azure portal, I could click a secret and it would generate it for me and let me copy it. Similar concept here. I now have a password. The expectation is that I will copy this to the keyboard and I'll never see it again. They are showing us a little bit of the beginning, so you can see that's there. And now, as we saw before, we had a wizard in the application registration in the Azure portal. Went through a wizard to talk about the various types of applications you're building. So now they call this Add Platform. And so I add platform, I can then choose, am I doing some type of native or mobile application or a web interface? If I choose the web interface, this is where I get my redirect URIs. Right? We saw this before where my app says I want to log in, and after the login is done, redirect the user back to a certain endpoint, and this is that endpoint I put in here. If I do a mobile application, this is going to be somewhat different. Right? So you can see here, I have the ID, and this is going to be a different flow, but you'll notice I can have both in my app, so this can allow both of those. And the implicit flow is allowed as well, based using if you remember back in our talk, part 2, where we went through the different flows, they're all supported here as well. Further down, you'll see I can add an icon into the app, and so there's various ways for me to make my app show up inside of in various launchers and so on, so that profile, the logo would go in there as well as a link to your terms of service and your privacy agreement. So that's how I create the application in this new portal. Now that I've done that, I'm going to come back here, and you'll notice live demo shows up. So it ends up being registered in the same directory. So it's just a streamlined interface for me to get that in there. So how are these apps, these V2 apps, different, right? So obviously, thinking about back when Office 365 has announced this unified API, in which I can go to graph.microsoft.com and access information about all services. Right now, we see that it's going to be Office 365-based things with mail and contacts calendar, and sites are moving in there, and files, which are under the covers, is OneDrive. And so they're unifying OneDrive and OneDrive for Business, so that if I'm using an API, I can call a common endpoint. We're also unifying the authentication mechanism, and as you've seen, when a user tries to log in, it says, hey, you need to pick, your account. Is it a Microsoft account or a work or school account? So this unification process is happening, and this part of this V2 is working on that as well. This is Azure Apps V2. There's another key difference here. I'm going to close all these windows for a minute here. If you remember before, well, I'm going to launch a new instance of Visual Studio here. And when we're in a new instance of Visual Studio, I'll show you the experience that we were using before when we're creating an app. So let me just do a new project real quick here. And I guess we got web application's fine. Let's call it web application 1. And we would do before is we would come through here and we would change our authentication. And after that was all done, we would launch the Connected Services wizard. Right? And so the Connected Services wizard would let me go through and request permissions for things that I wanted, my app wanted to access on behalf of the current user. We still have the client ID, we still have the client secret, all that stuff from before, right? And so we'll come in here, I right-click on my web application, I can choose Add and choose Connected Service. And in the Connected Service wizard, right, I would typically choose Office 365. I configure that, if you remember this screen here, where I would then log in or choose my domain. Right, this is the Visual Studio 2015 experience, a little bit improved from what we had before. And now I'm going to create a new one. That's fine. Next. And you can see in the wizard, you'll see you have calendar, contacts, mail, file sites, and so on. So if you remember, I had to go through and choose which permissions or which resources I wanted to get permissions for. This is the current integration scenario around Azure Active Directory and Office 365, right? And clearly, I don't have to choose Office 365 in this Connected Services wizard. There were other options in that dialog. So what's different now in the new V2 model is in the when I don't have this connected service, so I don't necessarily. I didn't have to run that wizard. What's different in this scenario is that we set up with this scope as a string here, and then when we're trying to make our call, we are going to pass in here. This is the call here to the auth context. If you'll remember from before, the authentication context is still that Microsoft.identity model, the API library that's provided by Microsoft. In this project, I'm running this experimental one. So if you look at the namespace here, it's Microsoft.experimental. So I've clearly this is in preview. But the difference in this authentication context, when I want to, say, get an authorization request, I pass in the scope that I want. So in this particular example, you can see here, I want to re-email the current user. The scopes are clear, pretty straightforward. It's not a URL that you would type in the browser. It's a string that represents the thing, the permission scope that I'm requesting. And as you can see here, this is then requested at, this is an authorization request at runtime. And so what will end up happening is that at runtime, when I ask for a resource, Azure Active Directory is monitoring whether the current user has granted permission to this current application for that particular scope. And so if in the version 1 model, if I first was just doing reading of messages, but then I wanted to add the capability to read calendar, I'd have to run that wizard, repackage my app, redeploy my app, and get updated scopes. In the V2 model, if I have just changed my code, I don't have to redeploy or re-register anything inside of Azure. The request will come through and say, hey, I want to do this additional scope, and if it's necessary, the common consent dialog would show for that. And so, again, just to show you, I ran this real quick before, so I'm going to run this now. We'll pick a different letter. We'll run this under Garth, I believe, is a good site. So this application, by the way, is not really designed to read all the API. I didn't write the code to read the messages. It's really just showing the experience here. So I'm going to click the login button, and let's use another account, and we'll use Garth. And we'll log into Garth. This being the first time Garth is logged in with this account, I get the common consent. So that flow still works. You'll notice here it says it wants to read your mail, right? And so, again, it has my application name and so on. I click accept, it'll go through, and again, this application is really just dumping back the auth code. And this code, I start using that tutorial that I'll show you in here, right? So here's the access token that was issued, and I can then use that access token to read Garth's email. So that's how the experience here. Again, the key difference from a developer perspective is I request this permission scopes at runtime, and they can change over time as the application matures or gets revisioned, and Azure AD will remember what permission scope has been granted by the current user for your application, and if necessary, they'll get additional prompts when you ask for additional resources. So I'm going to switch back to the slides here, and so you can see this, the apps.dev.microsoft.com is that portal, this portal here with my, oh, it's a blank page, but that's the app registration page. Here we go here. And so that's that URL, this first URL, dev.outlook.com. This is the tutorial, and I'll show you this page real quick here. This is what I had started to go through here. Run this. While that loads, we'll go back and show you here. If I come in here and I go back to my registration portal, you'll see my applications then get listed in this portal. Here's the Outlook Dev Center. Here's an ASP.NET application that you can follow through and go through, and it has step-by-step how to do the registration, how to put in the codes and the code in here. So that's pretty straightforward stuff, I think. So that's Azure Apps V2. Next thing we want to talk about is multi-factor authentication. And so if you remember when we were talking before about why I'm using Azure Active Directory and I'm, quote, outsourcing my authentication to identity provider, this is one reason why it may make sense, right? The infrastructure to have a second factor of authentication is pretty cost prohibitive for most organizations, and so leveraging what Microsoft can do for us or Azure is helpful. So multi-factor authentication, typically one factor is a username and password, and the second factor is a device or an email address that user has access to. And so in the Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication, the sending an email option is not an option. We can do these various things, right? So a phone call, we can configure and say, make a voice call to a phone number, send a text message to a mobile phone. You can run an app on a device is another option here, right? So you run an app onto the notification where it would prompt up and say, do you want the multi-factor auth to be a phone call to your desk or a phone call to your mobile device or a text? So you can choose at that authentication time what to choose. Or you can just have the mobile app generate a code and you punch in the code in the screen and like that. And obviously you can go to third-party tokens as well. And you can see there I have the documentation for multi-factor authentication. But again, we're not going to be doing a lot of slides here, so we'll switch back over to the browser, and we'll close these two apps here. And so here's my Active Directory, right? And so in this particular Active Directory, I've configured this for multi-factor authentication. At first, you'll see there's this provider link here. This really is not what we're looking to do. This is if I want to do some third-party token stuff. So I'm going to go into this Active Directory tenant, and I'm going to click on the Configure tab. And obviously there's a lot of stuff on here. They haven't streamlined everything in the portal. But one of the options in here is this multi-factor authentication. So we'll let this load up. And what we'd expect to see is the option to turn on or turn off the multi-factor authentication for this particular directory. I'm not seeing why we're not getting here, so let me hit the refresh button here and just get this to reload. Okay, so it's loaded here. If I scroll down, you'll see here's multi-factor authentication. I can manage the service settings. Again, I'm just managing these settings for this particular tenant, or this directory, I'm sorry, this directory. And so you can see here the settings are, do I want to have users create what they call an app password for non-browser applications? We don't use that so much anymore. If I want to have a set of IP range to do this, again, this is more of a conditional access type thing. And so these are our top level settings. But what I want to look on here, if I click users, this will then let me go through and go for all the users in my directory. Do I want to enable multi-factor authentication? I'm going to go back to the portal here while that loads, right? So you can see there's a couple other settings here. This, I've turned on the Azure Active Directory Premium in here, so there's other additional items that come in here, right? So along with notifications and the device showings is all kind of new stuff here, right? And so we'll get into the rest of these here, but just to say this becomes a very long list of things that can happen now once we enable that, right? And so I'm going to, I'll go back here. Multi-factor auth is still trying to load the users. My apologies for slow service today. Well, while we're waiting here, I'm going to open a new browser here. So I've already configured multi-factor authentication for a different user. Oh, here we go. So it finally showed up here. And so you can see Belinda, it's enforced for Belinda, right? So if I choose a particular user, you can see the information about that and whether it's on or off, right? So Alex is a user that we were just looking at before. If I were to manage the user settings, you can see here, does the user need to select the different contact methods again? So if they say they've lost the device and they want to be able to reset that, I can force that to happen, and I can, you know, clear things out of the particular user. But if I enable it for a particular user, we get this option here that says, hey, so here's a deployment guard if you haven't got it already. Here is a URL that you can send your users to register for this. So I'm going to just real quick click on this. And so you can see here that I'm logged in as the administrator. And so in this access panel for Azure, you can see here that I can make sure the information is valid and then either change my password. Note this person's not set up for MFA, so it won't look any different for him. So but if I go through and show Belinda, again, I'm going to log in as Belinda using a different browser. And so to get to that browser, I'm going to go to this access panel, that same URL that I just showed you. It should prompt me now to log in. And again, working on it. I logged in as me, so sign out. Oh, I forgot to do incognito mode, so let's try that again. Okay, so here's Belinda, right? So I'm going to log in with Belinda. It asks me for one factor, Belinda's password, and I'm going to sign in. And now that I've done that, it says, hey, this is the option for Belinda is send a text message to a phone number. So on my phone, which I can't show you, so sadly, but I did get the code. I think this is familiar to many people who have done multi-factor authentication. So Belinda's logging in with the one-factor username and password, a second factor, a code that was sent to a registered device. And now when Belinda logs in, we'll see that same page. You can see Belinda has been assigned to two different applications, Exchange and SharePoint. If I go to Belinda's profile, you'll notice here that I have the security verification option for Belinda to choose in what manner that second factor is issued. We, again, we saw this in the slide with the various options, and this is how Belinda can then choose. I want to text a code, I want you to call my phone, or whatever the case may be, and you can then choose which one you'd like right here. There is an app for all the mobile devices, and you can choose that. So the users can then set this page up again themselves. So if you remember when I was enabling this for a particular user, now that I've logged in with Belinda, I'm in the wrong screen here. Let me go back to this browser. So if you remember when we would go through and we want to enable this for a particular user, we saw this link to AKA MFA setup. That will run through a wizard that ends up getting the user back to this page for them to choose where do we want to send the information and so on. So let me cancel out of here. And then, so that's multi-factor authentication. Now the next thing I want to show you here, remember Belinda is configured for multi-factor auth in Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go back to my application now, and when we run this, I want to log into my application that's registered in this directory using Belinda's credentials. So this login now, when I say I want to log in as Belinda, again, I give Belinda's password, and you'll see here the same experience. Belinda is configured for multi-factor auth. In order to get into my application, Belinda needs to do the multi-factor authentication as well. So because my application is outsourcing the authentication to Azure, whatever Azure rules has in effect also apply to my application. So end users get a familiar experience. You can rest assured that your application is secure. There you go, clearly, now that the authentication has happened, Belinda can consent to my application, and again, we should just see the access token here, okay? So, beautiful thing. We don't have to worry about that code. We can leverage all that information, all that ability on my user's behalf. So again, multi-factor authentication. Next thing we want to talk about is managing Azure AD through application code. And so I was back and forth because I have a lot of demos to show here. I didn't want to go through and build the whole application on this, but I'm going to take this link and go to the Graph API. And so to get there, I'm going to go back to here and cancel here and open a new tab here under my administrator account for my directory, and I'll paste in that URL. And so this is the Azure Active Directory graph, right? So when people talking about the unified API, we have graph.microsoft.com, but there is, sadly, we're using the term, but the idea here is this is the Azure Active Directory graph. And you can see here that the Azure Active Directory graph has a lot of information. So I can get information about the current user, I can get a list of users, a specific one, groups, things. So basically I'm accessing different types of entities inside my directory, including applications and permission grants and so on. This page here that I'm showing you, again, it's in the slide deck, this will give you these links to do a little sandbox, if you will. So I want to get, we'll get the user, so the signed in user operation. So I'll do this get user. Here is an example of the page that says this is the request to just get the current user, right? graph.windows.net/me, right? And so you can see here I have a form for me to fill out the information. Who am I trying to get in here? Here's what the response would normally look like. This is wired up to a sample tenant. So this little MSDN page is wired up to a sample tenant. If I click the try button, you can see here it actually ran, and what I'm going to get back is the user here. This is Alex D, but this is not my tenant. This is a different tenant, right? So Alex 0 exists in the sample tenant as well, right? But you can see a lot of information about Alex, right? Including what services they're assigned to, CRM or NetBrief. You can see here they've been deleted. He's been deleted from these various things, but Exchange is enabled, SharePoint is enabled, and so on. Further down, attributes about Alex in the directory, things that I would expect to see, country, department, manager, and so on, right? And then down here, obviously the user principal name gets me into information that I'd expect to see, right? And then last surname. So all these things, if you want to do information or directory operations in your application, it's available. And I've said repeatedly, we're trying to outsource our identity management or our authentication, but at some point your application may have roles or groups, and you want to have an administrator do this. So if I have a group that, or I want a role or a function to be performed in my application, then I want to subset that role to a group inside of Azure Active Directory, but I don't want to have my Active Directory administrators maintain this. I want to have an administration page inside my application that would create a group and add and remove members to the group, similar to how SharePoint does its group management. And so I can go through and look at the groups, and I can write code in my application to create a group and add members to that group. So I didn't want to get one. So if I want to create a group, you can see it's quite simple for me to create a REST endpoint or a HTTP. Create a group. Here it is here. So I'm going to be passing in things that I'd expect to see. Notice we're doing security groups. And so I can do a post of that, pass in that information, and I can then create a group, right? And I'm going to scroll further down here, and you can see I can go through and I want to get a group's members. I want to add group members. So you can see here I can do a post to add members and passing in information. The object ID would be the group that I'm trying to update, right? I'm going to pass in here. And so you can see here the request body contains links to users, contacts, groups to add. I can add a group to a group. So just as you would expect to see that we have nested groups, I can still do that. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time writing sample code on this. The idea here is you certainly have this available to you to update your your directory as necessary. Okay. Again, if you want to just rely on synchronizing groups from your on-prem directory, or you want to have humans go into the group management screens, you can certainly do that. Right? And so the next thing, since we're talking about groups, there's a couple things I'll talk about. So next I want to talk about dynamic groups, and there's another one I forgot to include here on groups, dynamic groups and self-service groups. So I'm going to come back in here to my tenant here, and if I look on, oh, I'm sorry, so here's my list of groups, right? So you can see here this group we created last week, it's in here. Let me go back to the configuration screen here. And so you'll notice there's a section here called Group Management. And under Group Management, I can turn on, or what they call delegate group management. The idea here is that users can then create groups, and if a user creates a group, they own that group, and then that group owner can add and remove users to that group. This is just as I was discussing how we can do this in code, we can use this using the preview screen, or the Azure Active Directory screens is right. So I can choose as well if I'm going to delegate the group management. Users can create groups, yes or no. If you want to restrict the users who are allowed to do this capability, you can do that as well, right? And so by doing this, when a user logs in, they can then work on these functions. So I'm going to go back to the Belinda screen, so you can see here now, this is that Microsoft Azure profile page for Belinda, okay? And you'll notice across the top here, I have applications and then groups. I click on groups because my domain has enabled this. You can see here, Belinda doesn't have any groups. It went and checked. I've allowed all users to create a group. So by doing that, I can do this, have Belinda create a group. She can choose whether to have approval or anybody, right? And then the group type is security. Notice this is grayed out because that's the only type that's available. And so now we have a live demo group that is then provisioned. I'm going to switch over to my Azure screen. I go back into the directory, click on groups. I now have my live demo group. Again, it's sourced in Azure. It's not sourced on-prem. And if I look at that, and here you can see Belinda is already added as a member of that group. Belinda is also the owner of that group. Notice here I'm currently logged in as the admin, but the group was created by Belinda, just as you'd expect, okay? And so an administrator can come through and change these as well, but you'll notice I have this tab for self-service activity. Nothing's happened yet, but that's available for me to see. So Belinda can choose the group. It has one member. Let's add a member. We want to add Alex, and we'll add Garth. There's now 3 members in the group. Again, I'm going to switch back to the Azure screen. I go back to the live demo, go back to the members. Oh, give it a second to refresh here. Come on. I'm clicking a little too fast. Eventually, yeah, there we go. So now you can see that Alex and Garth are added to the group. The self-service activity, again, this is a little bit a delay here. Eventually that will show up. But as you can say here, I'm an administrator, so you know what? I'm not so sure Alex is the right person to add into this. So I'm going to select Alex to be removed, and it's fine. And we'll come back. Now, Belinda won't know any difference that it's been changed. She'll have to just notice or see what's going on here. But eventually you'll see, okay, again, we have the little delay here. Let's go through and flip back groups. And now we have only 2 members. Alex is gone, right? And obviously, the screen here is a little bit simpler. Notice it's touch-friendly, what you'd expect. If this group had set to have approvals, they would show up in the list here. I didn't do that. So you can see here now, I have self-service group management. This is part of the premium SKU of Azure Active Directory. But again, another option for your application to restrict who's allowed to do what functions, to do that authorization checks that are required inside your application. Now, group management can always be a pain, right? It's an administrative burden that no one likes to do, and it doesn't always get done quickly or accurately. And so Azure has this capability called dynamic groups. Again, one of the premium SKUs. So I'm going to switch back over to the application portal here. And I'm going to create a new group just to show you how this works. So we'll create the group, and now we have my dynamic demo group, and I'm going to click on that. And so now I'm going to go over to the configure option. And in the configure option, I want to enable dynamic memberships. And when I click dynamic memberships, you'll see here it says that we'll remove any current members. So, okay, I don't have any current, so that's good. And now I define rules that determine whether someone is in this group. And so by default here, you can see it'll list all the Active Directory properties in my directory. So the theory here would be if the department is equal to HR, then that person is in this group, right? So that is my sample dynamic group. So in the scenario here being, let's assume that we have a human resources management software, PeopleSoft or Workday or something, and that information is being maintained by the HR department, and so we know who is in a specific department. That information gets synchronized into our Active Directory, which then gets synchronized up into the cloud, or whatever reason, or user self-service, whatever the case may be. At runtime, when the user has logged in and they get that, which we saw 2 weeks ago on the session about how we can configure single sign-on and read information about the directory, or even if I use the API here to say, give me information about the current user, I can get these Active Directory properties and I can get group membership. Well, in this scenario here, if the department of the user is equal to the string HR, it will show them as a member of the group called Dynamic Demo. It's evaluated when the request is made to say, is Alex a member of Dynamic Demo? It'll look to see, does Alex meet the rules? So I don't have to just choose that. Obviously, you can see here I have this advanced rule, and anyone who has done any type of LDAP querying, you can see here that I can do some sophisticated selection using that syntax. Obviously, I'm not going to go into detail on that, but if you can do any type of selection, and these can be compound things, so it does allow me to put in things like and have another test here that would be user.surname equal Smith, for example, right? So you can see I'm allowed to do some kind of advanced items as necessary. So I'm going to discard that. So that is what we call dynamic groups, right? So just to see how this is working real quickly, I'm going to come back here and actually I'm going to go back in here and we'll choose this, configure this property here. And what I'm going to choose here is actually I'm going to choose surname starts with the letter D because Alex Darrow is in my group, so I'm going to save this. And then I'm going to go back to my group operations here. So let me go back up to the top of this one here. So I want to get groups. If I look at get groups, I want to try this out. Oh, this is their sample demo. I apologize. So it's possible using the REST API to get that. Okay, so I was going to try to make that up on the fly here, but it won't work because that's not reading my directory. So sorry about that. But that is dynamic groups, a very powerful capability. With the correlation that's been made, I've seen to many people is saying that if you are aware of what SharePoint audience is, it works in the same way. You define what makes up an audience, and then they're calculated. Similar, you define what makes up group membership, and that's calculated. Very powerful feature. So that's groups. Next, I want to talk about reporting. Right, so I have a screenshot in here, but again, you get a lot of different reports in various directories here, right? And so what you get is dependent a little bit upon your license level. And so let me real quick here. I want to close the Chrome and reopen that. So first, I'm going to go into just a basic directory here. So let me go here and do manage Windows Azure, and I'll just log in into my account here real quick. that again. That's what I get for typing really fast. I do it wrong. All right, so I'm logging in here to my Azure subscription here real quick. There's going to be a lot of stuff in here that's not germane to our discussion here, so we're just going to real quick zoom into the directory. And so when I click into the directory here, I don't want to see that at the moment. So there's a new reports tab here. So this is a simple reports here. And notice it's going right into some list of activities, right? So anomalous activity, I have 3. One audit log, right? And down below it says premium report. So you can see the reports that you get vary depending on your license level. I'm going to switch back to this directory that we've been working with in our demo where I've enabled premium. And so in this particular one, when I click on the reports tab, you'll see that it's a little bit more substantial. So I want to start here. And then I did some poking around and clicking yesterday trying to generate some activity, so we'll see if that has been captured. Obviously, this is not a live link into the reports. It's queued up, but you can see here, notice the anomalous activity has more choices than before, right? And so these are reports I can run against my directory. This top set here, the anomalous activity, again, Azure is doing some things on our behalf with logins. And a great example that was explained to me is, let's say that Belinda logs in and the IP address is registered to Chicago, Illinois. And 2 minutes later, Belinda's trying to log in with an IP address that's registered in London, UK. Clearly, within 5–10 minutes, the user cannot get from Chicago to London. That's some type of activity that doesn't sound right. It's a little fishy. And so that's what an anomalous activity would show, is that if you get things that are looking up that, sign-ins from an IP address for suspicious activity, could be, hey, maybe Belinda's credentials have been compromised, and you should look into it. So I can see that. Activity logs will go through. Again, you can see here how I have self-service group activity as well as password reset activity. So I can, if I want to see what's happening when the groups that, again, yeah, I mean, it's not, it hasn't caught up yet. That's a little unfortunate. So, but you can see the idea. Let's try audit report. So we should have some audited events in my directory. Yeah, so here we go. There's one. So 9:30 is today. So you can see here that a service principal was added. Well, that was what I was doing some application registration here. Here's where Alex was going through, and Alex was running the IT Unity demo. So there was some work going on here. The deletes, groups were added, deleted, and so on. So you can see, and here's when Belinda was updated yesterday for the multi-factor authentication. So I can see information about what's happening in my directory, right? I can get reports about the applications that I've configured. Again, what's happening with those application usage that's being integrated, and obviously if you're using rights management, you have that as well. And a new thing that's relatively recent is this external access or invitations. And so I didn't talk about that earlier, so let me go real quick on that. It is quite possible, if you've used Office 365, you know how you can do external sharing. Well, those accounts get added to the directory as well. And so at the bottom, user access. So the idea here is, do I want to allow an end user to invite someone, a guest, into my directory, and can that guest invite someone else, right? And so in order for Office 365 sharing to work, because your Office 365 tenant is tied into an Azure Active Directory, we have to have those accounts then show up in the directory. And so if I turn off the allow invitations here, I'm going to basically turn off external sharing. But this gives me the ability to see what guest accounts have been added and make sure that I'm limiting their access to only the things in an application that they should be. I want to make sure I don't have guests get put into my directory and then they start searching my directory for other, coworkers or just things that they shouldn't be seeing. So you certainly want to be on top of what's happening there. And of course, that report that shows me invitation summary, so I can see who is inviting whom and make sure if I need to follow up, I can certainly do that. Again, the reports are, again, differ based on the licenses that you've signed up for. And this last tab here, being licenses, is premium, right? So I turned on the premium here just for a trial to show you this, and the idea here is that I can assign users to these licenses, and that then lights up different capabilities. So for example, in order for Belinda to have multi-factor authentication, Belinda needed to have a license. So she's the only one in which I've enabled, right? So There's no requirement that says I have to have every user have multi-factor auth. I don't need to have a premium license for every user. And that might be a typical scenario. If I have a sales staff that's out and about and they're always on the road, I might want them to do multi-factor because there's a high risk that they, maybe they're at a public Wi-Fi and credentials get sniffed, or they lose a computer or something like that. I want to make sure that they have multi-factor auth. But for the back end or the back office people who are in the office every day, it's less of an issue for multi-factor in those scenarios. So I can pick and choose which accounts use the premium features. Again, the premium features being multi-factor auth, the self-service group management, self-service password reset as well, which I didn't show here, but that's available. And so those are the kind of things that you want to decide whether I want to go premium or just leave things as with the basic or free. Just thinking about this now, I should probably go through and show you. I'm going to click through to the documentation just to show you that they do have the comparison of what's available in which edition should I choose. And so you can see here, as you'd expect, in the comparison chart, they'll go through and they talk about what's available in basic, what's available in premium and free. And so here's a chart that shows which things are, what license is required for which feature you're trying to work with. Okay. So you can see the premium-only features gets the self-service group management, and gets me multi-factor auth for cloud and so on. All right. And so that's available. You can see that through the documentation link as well. Okay, so I'll go back to the portal on that. So one thing that's not included in my slide deck, and it's relatively new here, is this new Azure. You can connect your directories to business-to-business or business-to-consumer users. And so if I go back into, I was just there on the page. My apologies. If I go back to the documentation page, come on, let me just do this the shortcut way. On the documentation page, so this is information. It's relatively new. Azure Active Directory B2C, which is business to consumer, and this is the Microsoft's roadmap for being able to allow users to log into applications that are, consumers in your application. So if you're an application and you want massive audience of consumers to log into your application, but you don't want to maintain those user accounts in your own directory, you'd like to use the social logins, if you will, the Facebook or Twitter or Google logins. This B2C, Azure Active Directory B2C offering is intended to allow that happen, so that inside your directory you would just be storing an object ID for a user, but it really represents a login from Google or a login from a Facebook or Twitter and so on. So that's relatively new. It's just been released recently. There is also a B2B offering as well to have, if your business partners, you want to set up an extranet scenario, for example, if they already have an Azure Active Directory, you can then let them log in with the account in their directory, similar to how we would do federated logins on premises using a trusted identity providers. So those are a couple things that are available coming down. They're in preview, obviously more advanced scenarios. So they're not included in the slide deck, but I wanted to at least make sure you were aware of that. So returning back here, here's a sample of the audit report. So you can see I put that in there. And that's it. So we have about 10 minutes left here. I wanted to make sure there's any questions over any of the three sessions. Again, the key takeaways here, if you're a developer, don't write code to do authentication, outsource that to some provider. Cloud-hosted identity management is certainly going to make your life easier. Synchronize as necessary, and make sure that your code is secure, your resources are protected. Thank you, and I'll be monitoring the question window.